In a recent video, which I will link in the description, Thunderfoot supposedly debunked SpaceX's massive savings over other rocket companies in terms of their cost to orbit per kilogram. While he has a number of valid points, Thunderfoot overstates his case and invalidates his argument in many ways as well. Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. Thunderfoot is quite the intellectual internet troll. He has nearly 1 million subscribers. He's made a number of very impressively deep videos debunking everything from perpetual motion machines to solar roads to thorium-based cars, and lately he's been on a bit of a kick against Tesla and SpaceX. Thunderfoot's videos are always well researched and the presentation is fun. Trolls are really fun after all if you're not the target of them, but the videos also often overstate their cases and deny the validity of any counter arguments. Of course, that's just Thunderfoot's style, and I've enjoyed his videos many times over the years, and in fact have been subscribed to him for years. Anyway, I just want to take a note that I'm taking a bit of a risk to my self-esteem, even wading into this pool, because I know that Thunderfoot has as many fanboys as Elon Musk does. Maybe not as many, but he has very rabid fanboys. So anyway, there's a chance that this video might get some significant backlash from his followers. But you know what? That's actually okay. It's always good to watch the Watchmen and see how accurate they are being. And in this case, there are a lot of slippery numbers that sound impressive but are being used in a somewhat disingenuous manner. Before we begin, let's set the stage, so to speak, by discussing mature versus developing technology. The internal combustion engine car versus the battery electric vehicle like Tesla, VW, Ford, etc. ICE cars are very mature technology while battery electric vehicles are a very much developing technology, so costs are dropping rapidly for BEVs while they're staying pretty much stationary for ICE cars. Getting more to space and astronomy, we could also look at the Soyuz, which by the way was around when Apollo was, which is kind of mind-blowing. It's like a historical artifact that's still launching into space. And of course, the Space Shuttle versus newer rocket technology like SpaceX, RocketLab, etc. Again, for these rockets, the mature technology costs are pretty well set. By the end of the Space Shuttle, or certainly by now with Soyuz, it's very difficult to squeeze any more juice out of an old turnip. And by the way, that's a really gross metaphor. I don't know where that came from. But anyway, if you look at my video about Wright's Law up here, you can see that what happens with a new technology is that every time you double the amount of, in this case, rockets launched, you will decrease the cost by a certain percentage. But when you have a lot of rockets launched, it takes a lot longer to decrease by that same percentage as when you're initially developing it and have just a few rockets launched, and then you can save a great deal per rocket launch. So anyway, versus a mature technology, a developmental technology or even industry is rapidly reducing costs and improving its technology all the time. So anyway, when comparing numbers in this video, it's really important to remember what is developmental technology versus what is mature technology and how those numbers compare appropriately. All right, so on to Thunderfoot's video itself. The video unfortunately starts with an ad hominem guilt by association initial attack on Musk's Boring Company and the Hyperloop. The argument here goes, Elon as a CEO of Boring Company and Hyperloop, though Musk really has no stake in that push anymore, he makes exaggerated claims. As the Boring Company is owned by Elon Musk, and Elon Musk also is the chief technology officer of SpaceX, his exaggerated claims get transferred over to SpaceX's exaggerated claims. Anyway, this is off topic to Thunderfoot's video, and it's kind of not cool as a means to launch an argument. And also we have to assume that Thunderfoot is correct in all of his numbers about the Boring Company for his arguments. This is not my domain, so I'm not going to argue those numbers. But if someone else does have those numbers and wants to take a look at that particular aspect of the video, definitely have at it. So on to the meat of the video, which is SpaceX versus the Space Shuttle. In sum total, including all development costs and launch costs, the Space Shuttle cost around $1.5 billion per launch, according to Thunderfoot's reference, with a max of 27,500 kilograms cargo per launch to space. So Thunderfoot claims around $60,000 per kilogram to space. From looking around myself, I see the estimate is between $1.2 billion and $1.5 billion in 2010 dollars, depending somewhat on whether you take the full program costs into account or just the actual launch costs. For now, we'll just leave this in 2010 dollars because SpaceX's initial NASA contract was in 2008. So anyway, for the space shuttle, let's go conservative. Let's go with a $1.2 billion per launch, which reduces the per kilogram cost, assuming the shuttle was always crammed, packed full, to $43,636 per kilogram. But of course, the space shuttle wasn't always maxed out weight-wise, so this is a bit of a generous estimate. But then again, neither is the Falcon 9, so that's a generous estimate for them too. So anyway, we'll just assume they're always completely full. And now we get to an obvious big problem. The space shuttle was a very heavy, giant plane that had to go to orbit and back, and that reduced its payload weight by a lot. So no matter what your technology, there's obvious savings to be had by launching a much smaller shell to get mass to orbit. And this has nothing to do with SpaceX, by the way. ULA is cheaper, as is Ariane, as is RocketLab, etc., etc. It's just cheaper not to haul a giant plane to orbit due to physics and the rocket equation. So anyway, Thunderfoot starts with a 2018 paper by a NASA author that shows that SpaceX is charging $2,720 per kilogram to orbit, which is, according to the article, a 20 times reduction in cost per kilogram. With my more conservative $1.2 billion per launch, I get 16 times, but around the same amount of reduction, which, by the way, is massive. Now, of course, Thunderfoot has a very valid point here. The space shuttle was human-rated, while the Falcon 9 cargo is not, and thus cost to orbit is expected to be cheaper for the Falcon 9. But here's where Thunderfoot's numbers start to get a little bit slippery. Looking at a common current launcher, the ULA Atlas V, the cost per kilo right now is advertised at $11,122 at a minimum. This is their base model, best case LEO plane scenario at 28.7 degrees. It goes up rapidly from that price. So that price is current and only cargo rated, and it's still over 4 times as expensive as what SpaceX is charging. So this is a real world numbers comparison, not historical comparisons, and therefore I think it's probably a significant amount more valid than this historical comparison that's going on. Anyway, the article that Thunderfoot quotes was from 2018 by a NASA Ames author, not SpaceX, and the author, Harry Jones, is the one quoted as claiming the 20x reduction. But this was a comparison between current SpaceX and historical space shuttle. The claim here was not that SpaceX was 20 times cheaper than other options on the market today, but that it was a vast improvement over the old way of doing things when payload was launched via the space shuttle. Now, this comparison in the article is in fact a weak one, as Jones is taking the full developmental costs of the space shuttle and comparing them to the current mature technology costs of the Falcon 9 launches in 2018. So it's valid to point that out as, let's say, a very generous benchmark to compare Falcon 9 launches to. But as he's talking about this, Thunderfoot doesn't note this developmental versus current pricing mistake, as in the end it would hurt his own case. Instead, Thunderfoot takes these numbers and runs with them as if SpaceX itself was claiming it was 20 times cheaper than others on the market today. They don't, but they are around 4 times cheaper, as we just saw. And honestly, who's going to want to pay 4 times more for a ride? That's what really matters. Even 10% cheaper would be a killer advantage. 400% is strangling the other launch companies' businesses. These rockets, after all, are just really high-tech, expensive taxis, and people are very price sensitive to taxis. Witness the rise of Uber, Lyft, and so on. And the thin launch schedule for other companies is a fact. ULA, for example, only has about 10 launches per year. SpaceX is just cheaper and as reliable now as other companies, and thus they are winning most of the contracts. But okay, let's continue down Thunderfoot's rabbit hole now. Thunderfoot's main claim is that SpaceX is lying about the 20x savings, which they are not. Again, it was an article by a NASA author that made this claim. Anyway, the numbers Thunderfoot now pulls out are, quote, total cost to orbit, not claimed cost to orbit. As a note, Thunderfoot specifically states claimed cost to orbit per kilogram, which is not true. This is advertised cost to orbit per kilogram by SpaceX. In other words, if I have $62 million in my pocket and I want to send 20,000 plus kilos to orbit, I can call up SpaceX and make that happen today. And by the way, anybody have 62 million bucks I can borrow? Anyway, that's not a claimed cost, that's an actual cost. So it's incorrect to state this as a claimed number. It makes it sound like SpaceX is making false claims, and they're not. That's what they're charging. Anyway, going back to total cost to orbit, what Thunderfoot is stating is that an apples-to-apples comparison between the Space Shuttle and Falcon 9 should take into account the total cost of getting SpaceX's Falcon 9s, in other words, the development costs. Fine, that's a reasonable request to make. So let's look at those numbers. NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract in 2008 to ferry cargo to the space station, and that is what Thunderfoot is basing his comparison to the Space Shuttle on. And to some extent, that's valid, as the article's claims are a total cost of the shuttle shuttle divided by launches, whereas the SpaceX numbers are for current launch costs, which don't take account of development costs that have already been covered. As a point of comparison, by Thunderfoot's own references, the Space Shuttle was down to around $450 million per launch by the end of its lifespan. The Falcon 9 can carry a max 22,800 kilos to best plane LEO, and that's about 28.5 degrees for them. That number is about 83% the weight the shuttle could carry, and launches are currently billed at about $62 million for the cheapest ride. So boosting this cost by 17% to match the shuttle's max capacity would increase the cost of an equal launch mass to around $72.5 million. Like I said earlier, the best estimate of later shuttles, not taking account of development costs, was about $450 million per launch. So using these numbers, the Cargo Dragon's current build cost is more than 6 times cheaper than the later shuttle launches, which again didn't account for development costs. This is a better comparison metric, and it still shows the Falcon 9 way outstrips the shuttle on a cost basis per kilo to orbit. It's definitely not 20 times cheaper, but it's not by any means the same as Thunderfoot claims. During the development period after SpaceX received the $1.6 billion contract from NASA, they ferried about 70,000 kilos to low Earth orbit on 12 launches. So the price to orbit then was around $22,000 per kilo, and that does compare pretty much evenly with the last space shuttle launches. But here we can see this is an unfair comparison. NASA was paying SpaceX to develop their technology during this period, in other words, to mature their spacecraft. So the proper comparison here should be to the space shuttle with its full development costs, which put it between $1.2 and $1.5 billion per launch. Taking the cheaper of these two numbers, we get about $43,500 per kilo to orbit on the space shuttle, which is double that of the Falcon 9, even during its development phase. And to be fair here, the space shuttle cost far more during the development phase than $1.2 billion per launch. So this is a very generous cost per kilo estimate. So Thunderfoot's claim that the shuttle and Falcon 9 cost the same per kilogram to orbit, and the shuttle was human rated, is simply incorrect by any reasonable comparison metric. The Falcon 9 was cheaper during its development, and it's many times cheaper today, as is the Atlas for that matter, and the RocketLab Electron, and so on and so on. Again, it's just plain physics. Smaller, lighter spacecraft can haul things more cheaply than a bulky spaceplane can. This simply makes sense. After all, lighter weight, non-human rated launches should be much cheaper, which is why Thunderfoot's argument that the Falcon 9 and shuttle cost per kilogram are the same is disingenuous at best. And of course, something that earlier launches didn't account for is that SpaceX is saving even more now due to reusing their Falcon 9 boosters many times over. Well, minus that last failed Starlink landing attempt. Oops. Rapidly reusing the most expensive part of the rocket simply has to save money over other companies. If it didn't, RocketLab would not be trying right now to recover their own boosters, and other companies wouldn't be scrambling to figure out how to do reusable boosters as well. As a little side note here, Elon does go a bit far when he compares the Falcon 9 boosters to commercial aircraft. Yes, reusing rockets 5 to 10 times is great savings, but these do have to be refurbished, and they certainly don't have lifespans of tens of thousands of flights. So they'll never, at least with this technology, be truly like aircraft that are very cheap to reuse. Saying they will be is definitely overstating the case, but certainly reusing something even 5 times over once saves a ton of money and the time to build new ones as well. Turning to Thunderfoot's refurbishment costs versus payload to orbit spreadsheet, let's take a look with more appropriate numbers. So first of all, refurbishment cost is not 50% as Thunderfoot initially states. That's space shuttle numbers, by the way. It's between 10% and only 0.4%, and these are the best numbers that I could find available publicly right now. So let's be really conservative and say a full 10% refurbishment cost. Again, that's for the whole craft, including the non-reusable second stage plus fairings, which means the actual booster reuse costs are far lower. Elon claims they're only 0.4% the cost of a launch, but let's put that aside for the moment because that may be overstating it as well. So again, let's be very conservative and follow Thunderfoot's numbers in our own spreadsheet. Thunderfoot keeps saying the numbers are just examples and don't matter, but they really do. In this case, you have to be as accurate as possible to ferret out the truth. If you look here at a 0.1% or 10% additional cost per rocket and 60% of the payload that an expendable rocket can manage, not 50% by the way, we get a break even at about 2 launches, and every subsequent launch saves more and more money. At the 6th launch landing number, which is being achieved today, costs are below half of an expendable rocket. That's pretty significant and will go up if they can manage to reuse them more. One other note here, obviously a reusable rocket can't get as much to orbit because it has to save some of that last bit bit of fuel in order to land, and that makes a big difference. But that total mass to orbit reduction isn't always such a big deal. Many satellites are far lower weight than even the reusable limit. In other words, they are more volume constrained rather than weight constrained. So in that case, there's no real sacrifice in capability to reuse the rocket, meaning savings are even bigger. So as Thunderfoot claims, SpaceX has not cut the costs of launching. So why don't they? Well, number one, this is all still highly developmental and experimental, as we just saw, in fact, with the Starlink landing failure. But also, and blow my mind here, SpaceX is a for-profit company, and they're already cheaper than everybody else. Why would they reduce costs more? And of course, they're investing this profit into Starship and Starlink development. After all, the funding for those experimental projects has to come from somewhere. So yes, they are still charging about the same as they used to, but also yes, if pressed to do so by competition, they could cut costs to the end user. It's just not necessary right now. So let's turn to that human-rated argument now. What about human-rated flights? Well, since we have Crew Dragons now, and Thunderfoot is very adamant about the human-ratedness of the Space Shuttle, let's look at that. According to Space.com, Crew Dragon costs NASA about $55 million per seat to launch. Boeing, by the way, will be a lot more at $90 million a seat, and Russia charges over $80 million a seat. If we take the later Space Shuttle launches at $450 million in 2010 dollars, and by the way, we multiply this by 21% because inflation has been that much since 2010. And by the way, ouch, my salary's gone up a whopping 5% since 2010. No wonder it's harder to make ends meet these days. Anyway, if we take that number and divide by 6, which was the average number of crew that went up over the last 30 or so missions, we get $90 million per passenger, which oddly enough is just about what Boeing's costs are going to be. This is a bit of a generous number, however. NASA paid for pretty much all development costs of the shuttle, while many of SpaceX's costs have been defrayed by other sources. At the $1.2 billion per flight that includes conservative development cost numbers, the cost per seat was more like $200 million per seat per launch, or about 4 times more expensive than SpaceX's current per passenger charge. And again, that's not accounting for initial space shuttle flights, which had far fewer than 6 astronauts on board. Anyway, this is a better comparison because SpaceX's Crew Dragon is very much in the developmental stage right now. So the technology is being created and refined, and it's very expensive relative to what it will be in a few years as the technology matures. Again, you can see my Wright's Law video all about that. In any case, SpaceX's Crew Dragon is significantly cheaper than the shuttle was, no matter how you cut it. And Crew Dragon is human-rated, so that renders Thunderfoot's claims on that front somewhat moot. By the way, one other really important note here. SpaceX and Russia and China are the only 3 possible rides to space right now for human beings. Cost to orbit is important, but availability to orbit is rather important too. Without SpaceX, the United States would have no human-rated to-orbit capability, and only state governments, specifically Russia, would be able to get US astronauts to space. So whatever the costs, SpaceX has gotten the US back into orbit and done it for a cheaper price than we were paying to the Russians. And of course, I really doubt that China is going to be launching US astronauts into orbit anytime soon. So this is not playing with historical numbers, this is simply the current facts. SpaceX has a Crew Dragon in space right now. Who else can say that? And you know what? That capability matters. It really does. And finally, Thunderfoot ends with another quasi-ad hominem attack against Gwen Shotwell. And say what you will about Elon Musk, and he does get a bit carried away for sure, Gwen is a pretty level-headed person and doesn't go around making outrageous claims. In the video clip, she's talking about Starship, which we don't yet know the numbers for, and which she has a much better idea than we do about those actual eventual numbers. Anyway, I'm going to leave the latter half of the video alone because it's all just speculation on everyone's part at this point. When we get another 4 or 5 years into the future and Starship is flying regularly, we can revisit this part with better numbers. Anyway, in the end, Thunderfoot's video title should not have been SpaceX Busted, but SpaceX is 4 to 6 times cheaper per kilogram to space than the Space Shuttle was, not 20 times cheaper as one NASA paper claims. But that's not nearly as fun and clickbaity a title, is it? Again, I want to stay here. I really like Thunderfoot, I enjoy watching his videos, and I learn a lot from him. I just want to be sure someone is digging through his numbers and ensuring he's not playing too loosely with the truth. Yes, SpaceX is not 20 times cheaper than the shuttle was per kilo by a reasonable comparison metric. No, SpaceX didn't claim that, it was a NASA paper. And yes, SpaceX is still significantly cheaper than any competitor right now, both on a per kilo to orbit basis and for human-rated flights. In an industry where saving 10% is game-changing, getting to orbit 200 to 400% cheaper and more is mind-blowing levels of savings, and SpaceX is in fact doing this right now. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it fun and thought-provoking. If you did, definitely like it so other people can find it, and of course subscribe for more of this. Also, a big shout out to my patrons on Patreon. You all are wonderful. Thank you all so much for the support. And don't forget about our merchandise store, which now has the All Input is Error t-shirt and hoodie. And as well, we are Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description below, you can see how to support the channel just by clicking on a couple of links. And as always, thank you to Zenly Music for the intro and conclusion music. He's a wonderful artist. You should check him out on YouTube and Instagram. And finally, as always, feel free to ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.